Brief history of music. Music plays an important role in our life long before we even learn to speak. There's evidence that early man developed primitive flutes from animal bones and used wood and stones as percussion. It is from these humble beginnings that the music we enjoy today evolved. The Greeks and later the Romans influenced pre-Christian music. The musical experiences of traveling musicians brought diversity to the invention of new music. Surviving Greek notation from this period has given musicologists a vital clue regarding the music of previous times. The frescoes and the Bible teach us about the instruments featured in the Roman and Greek times. The old scripts tell us their significance to the cultures, like how the trumpet blew on announcements and ceremonious occasions. The lyre was an integral player in the songs sung by poets. In Europe, the monasteries and abbeys harbored music in the lives of those devoted to God. Christianity had established itself, and with it came a new liturgy that demanded new music. Although early Christian music had its roots in the practices of the Hebrew people, what emerged from this was to become the basis for sacred music. The religious chants devoutly followed the Latin texts written in the glory of God. Pope Gregory, 540–604 AD, is credited with the progression of sacred music and the development of what is now called Gregorian chant. It characterizes the haunting sound of the perfect fifth. Medieval period. Transitioning into the medieval period, which spans from around 500 AD until the mid-15th century. By this time music was a way of life. From taverns to cathedrals, it was practiced and sung by kings to paupers alike. The written music that survives from the monasteries allows us to assemble an image of a vibrant culture that ranges from the sacred to the secular. Throughout the medieval period, music slowly began to adopt more elaborate structures that produced works of immense beauty and devotion. Hildegard von Bingen and Peroton pioneered many of the musical forms, some of which we still recognize today, including the motet and the sacred mass. Alongside these important forms came the madrigal, which often reflects the emotions of people from that era. Renaissance period. In the Renaissance, instruments developed according to the composer's imagination. A full gamut of wind, brass, and percussion instruments accompanied medieval music, although it was still the human voice that dominated most compositions. Towards the close of the High Medieval period, we find the emergence of new and old instrumental pieces. Before leaving this period of music, it is important to mention the troubadours and the trouvères. These traveling storytellers and musicians covered vast distances across Europe and further into Asia. They told stories, sang ballads, and perhaps most importantly, brought influences from far, seamlessly blending with Western musical cultures. The Renaissance, 1450 to 1600, was a golden period in music history. Freed from the constraints of medieval musical conventions, the composers of the Renaissance forged innovation in the world of music. Josquin des Prez is one of the early Renaissance composers. He was a great master of the polyphonic style, often combining many voices to create elaborate musical textures. Later Palestrina, Thomas Tallis, and William Byrd built on the ideas of des Prez and composed some of the most stunning motets, masses, chansons, and instrumental works. As instrumental pieces became accepted in the repertoire, we find the development of instruments, like the bassoon and the trombone, giving rise to larger and elaborate instrumental groupings. This allowed composers more scope to explore and express their creative ideas. When keyboard instruments became increasingly common, the advent of the sonata followed in due course. Other popular forms of instrumental music included the toccata, canzona, and ricercar. Towards the end of the Renaissance, called the church modes, something unexpected happened. Music began to dissolve in favor of functional harmony or tonality based on a system of keys rather than modes. Baroque period. The Baroque period, 1600 to 1760, houses some of the most famous composers and pieces in Western classical music. It gave birth to some of the most important musical and instrumental developments. Italy, Germany, England, and France continue to dominate the musical landscape from the Renaissance, each influencing the other with conventions and style. Amongst the many celebrated composers of the time, G.F. Handel, Bach, Vivaldi, and Purcell provide a substantial introduction to the music of this era. It was during this glittering period that Handel composed his oratorio The Messiah, Vivaldi the Four Seasons, Bach his 6 Brandenburg concertos and the 48 preludes and fugues, together with Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas. Instrumental music was composed and performed in tandem, along with vocals. The virtuosity that began amongst the elite Renaissance performers flourished during the Baroque. During this period, common musical forms were established on old Renaissance principles of composition. It extended and developed in ways unimaginable. The suite was a Baroque favorite, comprising and contrasting the fast and slow movements, like the prelude, allemande, gigue, courante, and the sarabande. Concertos became more popular, allowing instrumentalists to display their technical and expressive powers. Vocal music continued to include the Mass, the oratorio, and cantata alongside anthems and chorales. Opera appeared to become an established musical form and vehicle for astonishing expression and diversity. Increasingly, the preferred harmony in music was tonal, and major and minor music keys were accepted in favor of modality. This lifted the limitations of modes and allowed composers to create expressive pieces that combined exciting polyphonic textures. Notation accompanied these developments. Eventually, the accuracy of the composition becomes detailed, giving us a better reflection of their intentions. Classical period. We step into the classical period, 1730 to 1820, from the Baroque. Now Haydn and Mozart dominate the musical landscape. The ornate Baroque composers of the classical period transition from the polyphonic toward the homophonic. Written music was simple and measured. One key development is that of the piano. The Baroque harpsichord gets replaced by the early piano, a more reliable and expressive instrument. Mozart and Haydn both wrote many works for the piano, which allowed this instrument to develop significantly. Chamber music, alongside orchestral music, was a feature of the classical era, with particular attention drawn towards the string quartet. The orchestra became popular towards the latter end of the period. It quickly began to include clarinets, trombones, and timpani. The rise of the virtuoso performer continued throughout this period. Opera flourished and became an accepted musical form of entertainment. Romantic period. As the classical era closed, Beethoven was the most notable composer who greatly contributed to the transition to the Romantic era, 1780 to 1880. Beethoven's immense genius shaped the next few decades by substantially redefining the classical era's established conventions. His work on sonata in his concertos, symphonies and string quartets is unmatched. The Romantic era saw huge developments in the quality and range of instruments. This encouraged more expressive and diverse music from the composers. Musical forms like the Romantic orchestra became expansive landscapes, where composers gave unbridled rein to their deepest emotions. In his Symphonie Fantastique, Berlioz is a fine example of this, or later Wagner in his immense operas. Gustav Mahler's symphonies stand as a pillar of achievement by the end of the Romantic period. Alongside the tone poems of Richard Strauss, the Romantic period presents us with a vast array of rich music. It is hard to believe what happened to such a triumphant era in musical history. But as we enter the 20th century, the musical landscape dramatically turns. Echoes of the Romantic era still thread through the next century in the works of Elgar, Shostakovich, and Arthur Bliss. However, it is the music from France that lits musical conscience. Debussy and Ravel are key exponents of this colorful movement. It parallels the artwork of Monet and Manet. The tonal system transforms to include a wider range of scales and influences from the Orient, allowing composers to write some of the most stunning works ever. Ravel and Debussy composed extensively on the piano, using poetry for inspiration. Their orchestral works are amongst some of the most beautiful pieces ever written. In parallel, The Teutonic world began to undergo its revolution in the form of the Second Viennese School, led by Arnold Schoenberg. Disillusioned with tonality's confines, Schoenberg threw out the tonal system in favor of a new 12-tone serial system giving each step of the chromatic scale equal musical validity. The result was serial music completely atonal and transformed the musical landscape almost beyond anything that had happened before.